We are past the halfway point of fantasy football regular seasons. I can't believe it, but we're getting you ready for week number 8 on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. Oh, look, Tyler Lockett just scored another touchdown. What's up, everybody? I'm Steven Andrus, joined by Jordan Cohn and Jesse Pantusco from the Radio.com Sports staff. Getting you ready for week 8 here. As always, we begin with pick 'em up waiver wire options owned in less than 50% of leagues. Be on the lookout, see if Chase Edmonds still isn't owned in your league. He'd be my top option, even though right now he's owned in more than 50% of leagues. But Kenyon Drake was carted off with an ankle injury during Sunday Night Football. Among players, though, owned in less than 50% of leagues, 2 more running backs from the NFC West to consider. 49ers rookie JaMycal Hasty takes center stage here in Week 8. The highest scoring running back of Week 7 at this point when we recorded this, Jeff Wilson Jr., Hasty's teammate, but Wilson left with an ankle injury, visibly emotional as he was carted off the field in that game against the Patriots. In relief, Kyle Shanahan didn't go back to Jerick McKinnon with Raheem Mostert on IR. He went to Hasty, the undrafted rookie out of Baylor, and Hasty delivered 10 touches for 73 total yards. Don't sleep on this undrafted rookie. Kyle Shanahan has a strong track record of unearthing fantasy gold for us at the running back position, and on the season, Hasty has been efficient. 5.2 yards per carry, 25 yards on 2 receptions. One other back from the NFC West, Seattle backup running back Carlos Hyde. His starter also left Sunday Night Football with an injury. Chris Carson, diagnosed with a midfoot sprain by his head coach Pete Carroll, scheduled for an MRI this week. In relief, Hyde against the Cardinals had 18 touches to just 3 for Travis Homer and 2 for DJ Dallas. Hyde clearly the back to pick up in that backfield if Carson misses time. Giants and Jets running backs, Wayne Gallman and LaMichael Pirine get honorable mentions. I'm just not rushing out to start a Giants or a Jets running back at this point in the season unless you're desperate or in a really deep league. I mentioned a 49er. Jordan, you got another one here among wide receiver candidates to pick up.
I do. Deebo Samuel's injury severity is not completely certain at this point, but it should be enough to keep him out of the team's Week 8 contest against the Seahawks, meaning that I'm looking at Brandon Aiyuk for a really good play this week, but also someone who I think has some value going forward regardless of Samuel's status. He's seen a fairly consistent workload in recent weeks, getting at least 5 targets in 4 of his past 5 games, and converting them with fairly high efficiency. For instance, take Week 7 against the Patriots. He had 7 targets, turned it into 6 catches for 115 yards. There's also always the possibility of work on the ground, as Shanahan is always creative in that sense. He's converted 2 rushing touchdowns on the year in consecutive weeks, going back to an earlier point this season. Should he impress against the Seahawks with Samuel out, there's no reason he couldn't establish himself further as a competitor for Jimmy G's top wideout target. And so I'm looking at Brandon Aiyuk as someone, and it's Aiyuk, Tony Romo. It's not Aiyuk. I'm looking at him for my waiver wire pick this week.
Jesse?
Well, we know the 0-7 Jets are having a rough go of it, but I'm still excited to see what the future holds for Denzel Mims, a promising second-round rookie out of Baylor. After missing the first 6 games with a hamstring injury, Mims finally made his Jets debut in Week 7, facing gangrene with 7 targets and a loss to Buffalo. Equally encouraging were his 4 catches for 42 yards, both team highs. There was some thought Mims might be brought along slowly, but clearly that was not the case. He was on the field for 80% of New York snaps, and while his 30% target share was probably a mirage, remember the Jets were playing without Jamison Crowder, there's a reason Mims was one of the most coveted receivers in this year's draft class. 6'3" with 4.3 speed, Mims checks all the athletic boxes. The Jets are usually playing from behind, so Mims can expect plenty of volume going forward. Now that he's healthy, I think Mims is at least deserving of a bench stash with potential to eventually blossom into a usable flex or wide receiver 3.
Among quarterbacks for waiver wire, too, keep an eye out on Tua Tagovailoa. Keep him on your radar as a potential dual threat option. We don't know how good he's going to be, but at least keep him on your radar. Let's move on to the stream team. Quarterback, tight end, and defense are top recommendations among those owned in less than 50% of leagues that you can not only pick up, but start in week number 8 based on the matchup. And I'll begin with our top streaming quarterback option. It's Carolina quarterback Teddy Bridgewater. We're going back to Teddy Two Gloves. We've mentioned him a couple of times this year. Week 8, he gets a rematch against Atlanta. The Falcons are allowing the most points to quarterbacks this season, more than 27 per game. They're also allowing the most quarterback points over the past month, more than 25 per game. Bridgewater, 19-plus fantasy points in 3 of his past 4 games, including Week 5 against Atlanta. And he could get Christian McCaffrey back this week, which would only buoy the rest of that offense this week. I like Teddy Bridgewater for week number 8. Jesse, you have the unattractive assignment of finding us a streaming tight end this week.
Well, I asked the question, is Richard Rodgers actually good? That's debatable. But fantasy is all about opportunity, and thanks to a biblical wave of injuries, Rodgers is suddenly the tight end 1 in Philadelphia. The amount of injuries to Eagles skill position players is almost laughable. Miles Sanders, Zach Ertz, Alshon Jeffrey, Dallas Goedert, Jalen Reagor, the list goes on and on. But Carson Wentz has to throw to somebody, and last week that somebody was Rodgers, who led the Eagles in both catches and receiving yards against the Giants. This may be the last week we can realistically stream Rodgers. Goddard is tentatively expected to return after the Eagles' Week 9 bye, but Rodgers will never have a better matchup than the one he has against Dallas in Week 8. The Cowboys have lost their last 2 games by a combined 63-13. We're watching a team in absolute freefall right now. The Cowboys have allowed almost 35 points per game and just permitted 16 PPR points to Logan Thomas in Week 7. If Rodgers hung 85 yards on the Giants, who are actually one of the better teams in the league at defending tight ends, just imagine what he'll do against the Cowboys' non-existent secondary.
Jordan, how about streaming defense?
Yeah, I'm going to rival that tight end is the toughest position to stream this week because it is rough out there for defenses. The best one matchup-wise might be the Raiders going against the Broncos, and the Raiders' defense has been the second worst in all of fantasy football. I'm not touching them. The Cowboys are the only team that's worse than them, and even they're 50% owned after their Week 7 matchup against Washington, with a good amount of others on bye as well. So I'm going to go with the Packers. They're only 14% owned, surprisingly, and they have a matchup against the Vikings in Week 8. They're not the highest ceiling defense that's going to be available, but the Vikings also aren't the highest ceiling offense. They're going to put up a modest amount of points as they usually do. Dalvin Cook still not be running at full health. And the Packers in Week 1 against the Vikings were able to force an interception, a safety, and a couple of sacks against the Vikings. Going forward, they're also going to play the Niners, the Jaguars, the Colts, the Bears, the Eagles, and the Lions. None of those offenses really scare me, so they might be more than just a plug it in for this week play, and you can hold on to the Packers D going forward.
Great point looking forward, especially if it's tough this week. Always a good idea to look ahead and maybe get a jump start on the following week's matchup as well. Let's move on to stealthy starts. These are players started in less than 50% of leagues that you can start with confidence in Week 8 as at least a flex option. And I'll begin with Eagles wide receiver Travis Fulgham, a show favorite. As Jesse mentioned, the Birds get Dallas in Week 8. Over the past 4 weeks, no team has allowed more touchdowns to wide receivers than the Cowboys. 8 touchdowns allowed to wide receivers over the past month. Fulgham last week started in less than 50% of leagues, but his past 3 games, 13 targets, 10 targets, 11 targets, 5 receptions, 70 yards, and or a touchdown in each of those games. Behold Carson Wentz's number 1 wide receiver, Travis frickin' Fulgham. Start him with confidence. It's 2020. Embrace the chaos. What a world. All right, stealthy start number 2, Jesse.
This is more about process of elimination than anything. The Browns are simply running out of healthy bodies. Odell Beckham exited Week 7 with a potentially serious knee injury, while tight end Austin Hooper is currently recovering from an appendectomy. With those 2 out of commission, I think we'll see a heavy dose of Jarvis Landry in Week 8. Landry isn't the sexiest play. He's still searching for his first touchdown and hasn't had a 100-yard game since Week 12 of last year. But we know what Landry is capable of. He's gone over the century mark in catches on 2 occasions with 3,000-yard receiving campaigns. More importantly, he draws a tasty matchup against the Raiders, who had no answer for Bucs slot receiver Scotty Miller in Week 7. I see Landry as a prime bounce-back candidate against Vegas, and who knows, maybe he'll even throw for some yards like he did Sunday at Cincinnati.
Jordan, finish us off here.
Will do. And I'm a big fan of the revenge game. My brother's a sports psychologist. He's always about that revenge mentality. So I like Le'Veon Bell going up against his former team, the Jets, in a revenge type game. Is there any other matchup you can think of that might spur that sort of mentality than going up against the Jets while the relationship is still bitter? The Chiefs are going to absolutely dominate, barring some completely unimaginable turnout, meaning running the ball is more likely than Mahomes throwing the ball a ton. And giving it to the RB2 as well, getting Bell some work to assimilate within the Chiefs system when the team is up big definitely won't hurt them going forward. Running backs average 150 total yards and a little over a touchdown per contest against the Jets so far this season. It's pretty bad. The Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds performance in week 5 serves as a good example of how it might look. Both of them had double-digit fantasy points. I could easily see that being the result for Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Le'Veon Bell.
And as always, if anybody out there has questions for their fantasy lineup or trade questions for week number 8, you can leave them in the comments of the YouTube page of this show. But for Jordan Cohn, for Jesse Pantusco, I'm Steven Andres. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. Good luck in week number 8.